Hi everyone, to another episode of Dimitra's Dishes. Today we're going to be making a delicious princess torte. I'm going to show you how to make two versions of this. One that's a bit easier and perfect if you're serving to a big crowd and you want to make it ahead of time and have it in little serving portions. The other version is a little more dainty and beautiful. They're both beautiful, but it requires a little more skill, but I'm going to teach you step by step how to do it. It's perfect for like a bridal shower or a very special occasion. These cakes were one of our most popular cakes in our showcases when we had the bakery. Because they're so pretty, you're going to see for yourself just how beautiful these are. They're made with 3 layers of a delicate light sponge cake. They're filled with pastry cream and light and fluffy vanilla whipped cream. There's some raspberry jam in there and then a rich marzipan to top it all off. The whole thing is going to be made from scratch. Let's get started. So we're going to begin by making the sponge cake. In my mixing bowl over here, I have 10 eggs that are at room temperature. To the bowl, I'm going to add 1.5 cups or 330 grams of granulated sugar and 2 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. And I'm going to beat this using the whisk attachment for 10 minutes. You want this to really grow in volume and get nice and fluffy. So do that on high speed. Okay, after 10 minutes, go ahead and add 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil. You want a light oil that's not going to leave much flavor. An extra virgin cold pressed olive oil would not work in this, but a light olive oil works really nicely. Mix that in. Over here I have 1.5 cups or 200 grams of all-purpose flour with 1 teaspoon of baking powder and 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And just go ahead and whisk that all together. And this is going to get added to the mixer while it's mixing on low speed in a few batches. So it's incorporated evenly and so that way it doesn't overmix. Once the flour is incorporated, the batter is ready. Over here I have 2 half-sheet baking pans that I've lined with parchment paper. I'm going to spray the whole parchment paper with some avocado spray. You can use baking spray, whatever you have on hand. You could even brush it with some melted butter. It's totally up to you. And then I like to use an ice cream scoop to distribute the batter evenly. I'll put 4 scoops in each pan, and then I'll do like 2 at a time. So that way there's an equal amount of batter in each pan, and that way I don't have to weigh them afterwards. And then just go ahead and smooth it out so that way it's in one even layer. And then just make sure that your oven is preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 180 degrees Celsius. They're going to bake in there for about 13 minutes. You'll know that they're ready when they're nice and golden on top and a toothpick that's inserted into the center comes out clean. They're also going to be slightly springy. The cake that's on the top rack is going to bake a little bit faster than the one in the center. So you might have to bake the one in the center a little bit longer, or when you take the top rack cake out, switch the cake that's in the center to the top rack so it can cook for an additional 1 to 2 minutes. Then you want to let the cakes come out, run a knife around them so that way they release from the pan. Set them aside to cool completely while you make the pastry cream and the marzipan. So while the cake is baking, you can go ahead and make the simple syrup that's going to be brushed onto the cake layers later on. Go ahead and add 1/2 cup of granulated sugar to a small saucepan with 1/2 cup of water. Bring that to a boil and then give it a stir. Once the sugar has melted, you can go ahead and add 1/2 to 1 teaspoon of pure vanilla extract. Give it a mix and then set it aside to cool completely. Now the sponge cake can be made weeks ahead of time. If you're making it ahead of time and keeping it in your freezer, like it's good to have sponge cake in the freezer because you can put so many desserts together like trifles or layered cakes and things like that. But you can go ahead and once it cools down completely, you just wrap it up with some plastic wrap, a few layers of it so it doesn't absorb any freezer odors. Mark it with the date and then it can stay frozen for a few weeks, even up to a month. It does tend to dry out if it sits in there a little bit too long, but it won't sit in there too long, I promise. The next component of the cake is the pastry cream. That's what we're going to be making next. This can also be made a day or 2 ahead of time and kept refrigerated. So for the pastry cream, you're going to need 4 cups of whole milk and 1.5 cups of granulated sugar. I'm going to add about 3/4 of the sugar to the milk and turn the heat on medium-high so it can get nice and steaming hot. And then I'm going to prepare my egg yolks. I have 8 egg yolks here. I'm going to add the remaining sugar to them. And we add the sugar to the milk so that way the milk doesn't burn while it's cooking. 8 tablespoons of cornstarch, 1/2 cup of heavy whipping cream. Whisk that all up until it's nice and smooth. And once the milk almost comes to a boil, you're going to want to add it little by little to the egg mixture to bring their temperature up. That's called tempering the eggs. Once all the milk is in there and it's mixed in really well, we're going to add everything back into the pot. I'm going to reduce the heat to a medium, and I'm going to cook the custard until it thickens. As soon as it begins to come to a boil, you're going to see that it's going to thicken pretty quickly after that. You're going to want to take it off of the heat, add in 2 tablespoons of unsalted butter and 3 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. Whisk that all together, and then I like to pass it through a strainer to catch any hard bits that might have ended up in there from the egg or from the cornstarch. Put it over a bowl and strain it. Cover it with plastic wrap. Put a piece of plastic wrap on top, otherwise it's going to form a skin, and let it cool completely. So now it's time to make the marzipan. In a big bowl, we're going to make the almond paste first. I prefer to make mine than to buy it. It tastes so much fresher and it's softer. I have 2 egg whites here. To that, I'm going to add 2 cups of almond flour. This is ground almond flour, 260 grams of it. 1 cup of confectioner sugar, and a teaspoon of pure almond extract. Just mix that all up until it's going to look like a cookie batter. If you're concerned about using the raw egg white in here, I think they sell pasteurized egg whites in the grocery store. That would work too. I've never tried it, but I don't see why it wouldn't work. But I've had this over and over again and no issues. But I'm going to leave it up to you to make that decision. Mix it all up. It's going to get a little bit harder towards the end, but as the more you keep mixing, the more it's going to stick together. You could even go in and use your hands towards the end. Oh, it smells so good. And that's it. Once it gets to this consistency, it basically looks like a thick, sticky cookie batter. It's time to start making the marzipan. So I'm going to use the stand mixer for this step. I'm going to fit the paddle attachment to it in a second. To the mixer in the big bowl, I'm going to add 3 cups of confectioner sugar. And then go ahead and start mixing it on a 2 or something like that. And add the almond paste in here a little bit at a time. So once the mixture starts to look crumbly, then go ahead and add 3 tablespoons of light corn syrup. It's an ingredient that I usually don't use, but it works so well in this. I've tried using simple syrup and it doesn't do the same thing that the corn syrup does. You use so little of it. And at this point, as it's coming together, I'm gonna add some food coloring. You wanna make sure you get the gel food coloring. You could use a green, a leaf green, or a light pink. Start off very slowly with 1 drop because it can get dark very quickly. You could always make it darker, but you can't ever take the color away. So I'm gonna do 1 drop. I want it to be a very pale green, and the minis, I'll make them a pale pink. Go in and scrape the bottom and the sides of the bowl. At this point, you could even transfer this to the counter and just knead it until all of the color is distributed evenly. You can do the whole thing in a bowl by hand. You don't need a mixer. The mixer just makes it a little bit easier. And a dough scraper is also a really good tool to have on hand for this recipe. I'm going to use it several times. So here I am, I'm going to put some powdered sugar on my countertop, and I'm going to transfer all of the marzipan right over top of it. And it is a good idea to put on some latex gloves or something like that so you don't get color on your hands, especially if you're doing 2 batches of this to make both of these cakes that I'm making. The next batch of marzipan, I'm going to tint it a very light pink. But look, 1 drop of green gave the perfect amount of color, so be very careful with the food coloring. Start off with very little. And that looks really good. I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this in plastic wrap, set it aside, and we're going to go on to making the final component of this cake, which is the whipped cream. So I do want to say that you can make the marzipan a week ahead of time and just keep it stored in your refrigerator. It stays fresh for well over a week, but it's a good idea to have these things made ahead of time so that way on that one day when you're putting the cake together, it's not that much work that you're going to have to do. Okay, so for the whipping cream, go ahead and add 4 cups of heavy whipping cream to a mixing bowl that's been fitted with the whisk attachment. I'm going to add the whisk attachment in a second. Then add 1.5 cups of confectioner sugar, or you can make it as sweet as you like it. You can add less confectioner sugar to this or a little bit more. I wouldn't do more. I think 1.5 cups is perfect. And 4 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. And we're going to whisk this first, starting off on slow and then raising the speed to high speed until it's nice and thick and creamy and looks just like whipped cream. All right, so now it's time to put the whole thing together. So parchment paper is gonna come in handy. Go ahead and flip this over. If you have a cutting board that you can flip it over, it's gonna make it so much easier. Peel the back parchment paper off and then go ahead and cut it into 2 equal portions. So let's measure this. should be 8 inches. Yeah, this is 16 inches wide. So we're gonna cut this at the 8-inch mark. This one is ready. And I'm gonna use the back of this baking tray just to make it easier to transport. So we're gonna use 3 of these quarter sheet cakes. Now I'm gonna teach you how to make the quarter sheet princess cake. Traditionally, these are made in a round shape. So you would use an 8-inch or a 10-inch round baking pan. It does get a little bit tricky to put the marzipan over such a large cake because you have to roll it out so much bigger. So I'm gonna teach you how to make it this way with a quarter sheet, like I said, which is gonna be a rectangle, and then you can just cut it into slices and serve it to your guests. This is definitely a special occasion dessert. Or I'm also gonna show you right after I do this, how to make little 4-inch round cakes, which are perfect for bridal showers, baby showers, spring gatherings, anything, even New Year's. It's perfect for any special occasion throughout the year, but we're gonna start with this one first, and then we're gonna do the small ones after. If you're doing the small ones first, then instead of cutting it into 4 pieces like we just did, you would use a cookie cutter and cut it into rounds, but I'm gonna go over those instructions right after we do this. So go ahead and transfer one of the rounds either onto a baking tray or a cutting board or something that's gonna make it easy for you to decorate the cake with. Even though the cake is pretty moist, this is a bakery secret, we always brush some simple syrup over the cake to make it extra moist because sponge cake does tend to dry out. So you wanna just put a little light layer of the syrup right over that first layer. Don't go too heavy, you don't want it to be soggy. Then a thin layer of raspberry jam. You can use your favorite jam, but raspberry jam is very traditional. And in Princess Torte, they put just one thin layer of raspberry jam, but I, at the bakery, used to make this cake often, and I love both of the layers to have a thin coating of this lovely jam. And I'm running low on this, so I am gonna substitute with a different jam, but raspberry is traditional because it adds a little bit of tartness to this cake. So this is 4 fruit preserves, not traditional, but you can substitute your favorite preserves in this. So I filled up a pastry bag that has a large open star tip attachment. I filled it up with the whipped cream. I'm just gonna put a border of whipped cream all around the edges. That's gonna hold the pastry cream in place. You don't have to do this, but it just makes for neat decorating. Next, the bottom cake gets a layer of pastry cream, a thick layer. Make sure to spread it evenly. Then we're gonna go ahead and put the second layer on top. Brush that with a simple syrup. Not traditional. At this point, you would just add the whipped cream on top, but I like to do another layer of jam, whipped cream around the border, which you don't have to do because whipped cream is going on anyway, but I like it because it keeps it in place. And then go ahead and put that third layer of cake on top. You're gonna have 1 layer left over. Just wrap that in plastic wrap and put it away, or you could make little minis, but you would have to make more whipped cream because it won't be enough. Go ahead and brush that generously with the remaining syrup that you have here. Focus on the edges because they do tend to dry out. And now we're gonna frost the cake with the remaining whipped cream. This is a very forgiving cake because it's gonna get the marzipan on top. And traditionally, it does have a dome of whipped cream on top when you're making it in a round shape. But in this case, since we're making a rectangular, we don't have to worry about loading the top with whipped cream. This is a simpler version. And you don't have to worry about the sides being perfectly iced, or even if there's crumbs in the icing, you don't have to worry about it because it's gonna get covered up with that beautiful sweet almond marzipan. And just go ahead and clean up around the cake. So very important, at this point you wanna put this in the freezer so that way the whipped cream can set, because when we put the marzipan on top, you don't want it to lose its shape. It's gonna take about 2 hours or so. This cake tastes delicious frozen, so if you wanna make this a night before and leave it in the freezer and then put the marzipan over the top, that's also a great idea. It freezes well for actually a month or 2, so it's up to you how far ahead you wanna make this. If you do wanna keep it in the freezer for a little bit longer, make sure that once it's frozen solid, you wrap it tightly with some plastic wrap, because whipped cream does absorb the odors that are in the refrigerator and you don't want that. I'm gonna clean up a little bit and then we'll roll out the marzipan and finish this off. All right, so once that whipped cream is firm enough where you can touch it and it doesn't squish together and lose its shape, go ahead and roll out the marzipan. So it's good to have a quarter sheet baking pan on hand so that way you can use it to measure. Even a 9 by 13 inch, you want it to be much bigger, almost double the size, but not really, just enough to cover the top and the sides. so use that as a guide. Put lots of powdered sugar on your counter because marzipan does like to stick, and try not to press too hard so you don't stick the marzipan to the counter. Otherwise, there's no point in rolling it out if you can't get it off the counter and put it on top of the cake. I like to use a big offset spatula to help me do this, and as I'm rolling, I'm also releasing the cake. If I see that it's sticking in certain places, what I do is I roll it a little bit on top of each other. I fold it a few times, and then I put more powdered sugar underneath it. The more the better when it comes to this because you don't want to mess up the marzipan. If it does mess up, and it will if this is your first time rolling out marzipan, no problem. You can just gather all the marzipan all together, stick it together again, and then roll it out into a large rectangle. Take out the cake and put it right next to the marzipan. Roll the marzipan onto the rolling pin so that way it's easy to transfer it and put it over the cake. And go ahead and drape that beautiful marzipan over the cake. Press it lightly with your hand so it can stick to the whipped cream, and trim the excess marzipan off from the sides of the cake. And that's really it. That's all there is to it. At this point, I do like to put it back in the freezer for about an hour so it can set, and it'll make it much easier to slice. Clean up your area. Any leftover marzipan can be rolled out into little decorations. I like to make little leaves to put on each slice. You can make little roses, or you can save the marzipan for snacking or for another cake. If you want to make the round cakes, this is what you're going to do. Once you bake the cakes, let them cool completely, and you make all of the other components like we did, the whipped cream, the pastry cream, have your raspberry jam ready and all that good stuff, and the syrup. I like to use a 4-inch cookie cutter, but you can make these much smaller too. It's up to you how big or how small you want to make these. I'm using a 4-inch round cookie cutter, and I'm just going to cut out rounds of the sponge cake. This is going to make 16 rounds if you're using the 4-inch round cutter. You are going to have some leftover cake. You can put it in a Ziploc bag or in an airtight container and use it to have alongside your coffee or something like that. Then what I like to do is I line 2 baking trays with parchment paper, and then I'm going to take 1 round at a time, and I'm going to brush it with the syrup. I'm going to put a layer of jam on the first layer. Pastry cream, I like a thick layer of pastry cream. Top it with another little round of sponge cake. Then go ahead and soak that with more simple syrup, another layer of jam. But like I said, you don't have to do the second layer of jam if you want to be more traditional, but it just makes it taste much better. Then I do a nice thick coating of whipped cream on top of that, and then I frost the sides with the whipped cream. When you're making the round cakes, you want to make sure that you put lots of whipped cream on top to create a dome shape. That's what makes these princess cakes really beautiful. Put them on the baking tray again, that's lined with parchment paper, really carefully using a spatula. If you're going to ice them, it's a good idea to do these on parchment paper so that way it makes it easy to transport from the counter or from your cutting board, wherever you're icing these, onto the baking trays. At this point, you want to freeze them because again, you want the cream to set, and then you can roll out your marzipan while they're freezing. Let them freeze in there. They're going to freeze much faster because they're smaller, about an hour, hour and a half max. Clean up, roll out the marzipan, and this time take out an 8-inch plate or something like that, anything that's round and 8 inches, and you could cut the marzipan 8 inches round, so that way you have plenty of marzipan to work with and they can go over the cakes very easily. Go ahead and drape that 8-inch round marzipan over the 4-inch round cakes, and go ahead and play with it so that way it's nice and smooth on the sides. You can just lift it a little bit and then press it on the side and trim off the excess marzipan from those cakes. And again, at this point, I like to stick them back in the freezer because once they've been handled, the whipped cream is going to soften up and you don't want them to lose their shape. Gather up the remaining marzipan and then you can form little decorations. I like to form them into little leaves, and I just cut the leaves out using a knife. I just free form it using, it's very easy to cut leaves out. I'm not very creative when it comes to cake decorations, but leaves, if I can do them, you can do them. You just cut out the leaf, then you can use the knife to draw in the little veins of the leaf, and then to stick them onto the princess cakes, you could either do 3 or 4 leaves per cake. You can go ahead and take some of that leftover whipped cream and stick it to the back of the leaf, just a tiny bit, so that way it sticks to the top of the cake. Instead of leaves, if you're very creative, you can make little roses or tulips and just put them in the center. I like to dust the cakes with some powdered sugar. If you have little candy beads, you could put a little bead in the center and that would make them look so pretty. You can make these cakes way ahead of time. So if you're making them for a party, you could do them 2-3 weeks ahead of time. Once they're frozen solid, wrap them tightly with plastic wrap and then let them thaw for about an hour in your fridge and another hour at room temperature. But if you ask me, I really like the way that the cream tastes when it's slightly cold and frozen. So it is best to serve these chilled. Once you cut into them, you're just going to see how soft and delicate these cakes are. They're going to be creamy from the whipped cream and the rich pastry cream, a little tartness from the raspberry jam, and the sweet, luxurious marzipan on top adds the perfect almond flavor. I think you guys are going to absolutely love these. If you're serving the big cake ahead of time, the quarter sheet cake that we made, you can definitely portion these out a day ahead of your party and keep them in the freezer and just thaw them out right before your party. I like to put them in little cupcake liners, and then you can transfer them to your serving dish, and they look so pretty. If you want to put little leaves on top, you can. If you just want to dust some powdered sugar on top, you can do that too. If you want to do a little star of whipped cream on top, decorate it like that. Let me know how you're making them in the comment section down below. This is a little bit more of an advanced dessert to make, but I think if you follow the instructions and you make it well ahead of time, you could definitely do this. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below, and if you have any more cake requests, post them and I'll get to them as soon as I can. The exact measurements for this recipe are on the website, dimitrasdishes.com. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. I'll see you all next time. Yes, us.